When the man everyone believed was dead walked through the church doors on my wedding day, I felt as if the whole world had stopped turning. There, in that moment, in front of everyone I loved, my greatest sin was exposed like an open wound. Good afternoon to all of you watching. My name is Evelyn, I'm 79 years old, and I'm here today to share with you the most painful story of my life. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. It would bring me joy to know my words are reaching so many different places. Born in 1946, I grew up in a small town in rural Kentucky where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets rarely remained hidden for long. We were a traditional community where a person's word had value and a young woman's reputation was her most precious asset. My parents, simple, God-fearing people, raised me with strict values, always teaching me about the importance of honesty and fidelity. At 15, I met Robert during a church social. He was 17, the pharmacist's son, and from the first moment our eyes met, I knew there was something special. Robert wasn't like other boys. While most dreamed of taking over the family business or working at the factory, he had bigger dreams. He wanted to study, become a teacher, change lives through education. We started dating with our parents' permission. It was a respectful courtship, as the customs of the time demanded. We saw each other on Sundays after service, always accompanied by a family member. We exchanged letters full of promises and dreams. And how we dreamed. We planned our house, the children we would have. We'd even chosen their names. When Robert turned 18, he received news that would change our lives. He had been accepted to study at the state university in the capital. It was a unique opportunity, something practically unimaginable for a young man from our town in those days. I remember the mix of pride and fear I felt. Pride in the man I loved, fear of losing him to the big world that awaited. "I'll come back for you, Evelyn," he promised the night before his departure, holding my hands in his. "I'll graduate, get a good job, and return so we can marry. Will you wait for me?" How could I not wait? Robert was everything to me. The first love, the first stolen kiss behind the church, the first and only man I imagined by my side for the rest of my life. I swore I'd wait, no matter how long it took. We exchanged promise rings, and he left, taking a handkerchief embroidered with my initials, something he could feel and touch when the longing grew too strong. The years that followed were filled with waiting and anxiety. The letters arrived weekly, each one read and reread until the folds in the paper threatened to tear. Robert told me about his classes, the professors, his new friends, the challenges of living in the big city. I replied telling him about life in our small town, the local gossip, my sewing lessons, how everything seemed slower and grayer without his presence. In 1967, after 5 long years, Robert finally completed his studies. He returned to our town with a diploma in hand and a guaranteed job as a teacher at the only local high school. Our wedding was set for 6 months later, enough time for him to establish himself professionally and for us to organize the ceremony. I was 21, radiant with happiness. After so much waiting, I would finally realize my dream of becoming the wife of the man I'd loved since adolescence. My friends envied me. Robert was an excellent catch, now more than ever. Educated, cultured, respected, and completely in love with me. The preparations for the wedding began immediately. My mother and I sewed my wedding dress together, using a special fabric Robert had brought from the capital. The house where we would live after marriage was painted and gradually furnished. We spent hours planning every detail, from the wall colors to where we would place the china cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother. It was during this time when everything seemed perfect and happiness was so close that fate, or perhaps my own weakness, put a stone in our path. 3 months before the wedding, Robert received an invitation he couldn't refuse to participate in an educational conference in New York City where he would have the opportunity to meet important educators and present his ideas. It would mean an absence of 4 weeks, the longest separation we would have since his return from university. "It's the chance I've always dreamed of, Evelyn," he told me, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. I can bring new methodologies to our school, improve our children's education. You understand, don't you? Of course I understood, and I supported his decision with all my heart. We said goodbye at the bus station with the promise that he would write every day. And he did write, letters full of news, experiences, and longing. Meanwhile, our small town received a group of engineers and workers. The government had approved the construction of a dam nearby, a project that promised to bring progress and jobs to the region. It was the talk of the town. At the time, I worked part-time at the town hall, helping organize documents. That's where I met him, Daniel Ferguson, the chief engineer responsible for the project. Unlike any man I knew, Daniel came from Chicago, had studied abroad, visited countries I never dreamed of knowing. Tall, always impeccably dressed, with a way of speaking that completely captivated me. Our first contact was strictly professional. He needed certain authorizations, and I was assigned to help him with the local bureaucracy. We talked formally, but I noticed how his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. In the days that followed, Daniel began appearing at the town hall more frequently than necessary. He always had a doubt, an extra document, a consultation to make, and always asked for me to assist him. "You're the only one who understands all this bureaucracy," he would say with a smile that made my heart race, even against my will. One afternoon, at the end of the workday, he invited me for coffee. "Just to thank you for all your help," he explained. I hesitated, thinking of Robert, of my commitment, of the unwritten rules of our community. But it was just coffee in public. What harm could there be? That coffee turned into another the next day, and then into lunch. Daniel spoke of a world I had never experienced, of big cities, plane trips, fine restaurants, and theaters. He listened with genuine interest when I talked about my simple life, as if every detail were fascinating. No one, not even Robert, had ever looked at me that way before, as if I were the only woman in the world. It was like this in small steps that I began to walk the path to the biggest mistake of my life. The line that separates friendship from attraction is thin, and I crossed it without realizing it. Or perhaps I did realize it, but didn't want to admit it to myself. I remember exactly the moment when everything changed. We were walking after lunch when it suddenly started to rain. We ran to take shelter under the awning of a closed shop. We were wet, laughing like children. That's when Daniel touched my face, pushing aside a wet lock of hair, and looked at me in a way that made my entire body tremble. "You're the most enchanting woman I've ever met, Evelyn," he whispered. And before I could react, his lips were on mine. I should have pulled away immediately. I should have slapped his face. I should have run away from there. I should have remembered the wonderful man who was waiting for me, trusting me completely. But I did none of those things. I returned the kiss with a passion I didn't know existed inside me. That kiss opened the door to something I never imagined myself capable of. In the weeks that followed, while Robert wrote me passionate letters from New York, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the devoted fiancé, making preparations for the wedding. In the afternoons and some evenings, I secretly met with Daniel. Our meetings took place in a secluded house that the company had rented for the engineers. I invented excuses for my family, extra sewing classes, visits to friends, helping with church preparations. Each lie easier than the last, each betrayal deeper. What I felt for Daniel wasn't love. Now I can see that clearly. It was fascination. It was the taste of the forbidden. It was the excitement of a life completely different from mine. He represented everything I would never have, everything I would never be. Robert was my safe harbor, my life companion. Daniel was the storm that dragged me into the unknown. "Come with me to Chicago when the project is finished," Daniel proposed one afternoon as we lay in his bed. "There you can be who you really are, free from these antiquated customs, this provincial life." I remained silent, frightened by the proposal. For the first time, I truly faced what I was doing. I was risking not just my marriage, but my entire life, my family, my reputation. "I can't, Daniel," I finally replied. "I'm getting married in a few weeks. Everything is already prepared." "You don't love him," he insisted. "Not like you love me. What you feel for him is comfort, familiarity. What we have is true passion." But he was wrong. I loved Robert. I always had. What I felt for Daniel was temporary madness, a deviation from the path to happiness that I had planned for myself. And it was with this thought that I decided to end that insanity. On the eve of Robert's return, I met with Daniel for the last time. I told him we couldn't see each other anymore, that it had been a mistake from the beginning, that I loved my fiancée and would go through with the wedding. Daniel didn't take it well. For the first time, I saw his possessive, almost violent side. He yelled, broke objects, accused me of having used him, of being a hypocrite like everyone else in that backward town. Finally, when he saw that my decision was unshakable, he uttered words that would haunt me for a long time. "This isn't over, Evelyn," he said, his eyes burning with anger. "You'll regret choosing him over me. Mark my words." I left there trembling, but determined to bury that chapter of my life. Robert would return the next day, and I would be the perfect bride he deserved. He would never know of my betrayal, never suffer for something that was already over. I convinced myself it was the right decision, that telling the truth would only cause unnecessary pain. When Robert returned, radiant with experiences from the conference, I threw myself into his arms with remorse and relief. He brought me a small gift, a delicate pearl brooch that his host in New York had helped him choose. "For you to wear at our wedding," he said, kissing me with such tenderness that I felt tears in my eyes. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activities. Robert was busy implementing new methods in his classes, enthusiastic about the ideas brought from the conference. I immersed myself in the final wedding preparations, as if dedication could erase my guilt. Occasionally, I would cross paths with Daniel in town. He would look at me with a mixture of desire and resentment, but never approached. I prayed for the dam construction to finish soon, and for him to leave before the wedding. God, however, had other plans for us. 2 weeks before the wedding, when the invitations had already been distributed and my dress was ready for the final fitting, tragedy struck. I was at the town hall organizing the final documents needed for our marriage when I heard the commotion in the hallways. People were running, phones ringing nonstop, raised voices discussing all at once. "There's been an accident at the dam," someone shouted. "A landslide." My heart immediately raced. The first person I thought of, to my eternal shame, wasn't Robert, but Daniel. I left my office and found the mayor, pale, speaking with the head of the town's small rescue team. "How many victims?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The mayor looked at me with heavy eyes. "We don't know yet. 3 or 4 workers are missing, and one of the engineers too." "Which one?" I insisted, holding the edge of the desk to keep myself standing. "The boss, that one from Chicago, Daniel Ferguson." I felt the floor disappear beneath my feet. I excused myself and ran to the bathroom, where I vomited everything I had eaten for lunch. The guilt was consuming me from inside. Had my rejection left him distracted? Had he done something reckless because of me? In the hours that followed, the small town transformed into a rescue operations center. Volunteers headed to the accident site to help search for survivors. Robert was among them, always the first to offer help when someone was in need. If only he knew he was risking his life to save the man who had slept with his fiancée. I spent that night sleepless, kneeling beside my bed, praying as I had never prayed before. I prayed for the victims, for their families, for Daniel. But God forgive me, I also prayed for myself. I prayed that my secret would never be discovered, that I could go on with my life beside Robert without the shadow of betrayal separating us. By morning, the news was grim. 2 bodies had been recovered, workers from the project. 2 more men were still missing, including Daniel. The searches would continue, but hopes diminished with each hour. Robert returned home exhausted, covered in mud, with red eyes from having witnessed too much suffering. I hugged him tightly, smelling the earth and sweat that permeated his clothes. He had spent the entire night at the accident site, helping dig through the debris with his bare hands. "It's horrible there, Evelyn," he told me as I prepared a hot bath for him. "An entire section of the hillside came down. We found 2 poor fellows, but the others—" His voice failed. "The chances are practically 0. In the days that followed, our small town experienced a collective mourning. The families of the dead workers received support from the community. One of them lived right there. The other came from far away to retrieve their loved one's body. The searches continued, but with decreasing intensity. On the 5th day after the accident, the mayor convened a meeting with the authorities and officially announced that the searches would be ended. The missing men, a worker from the northern part of the country and engineer Daniel Ferguson, would be declared dead. The area was too unstable to continue operations without putting more lives at risk. A ceremony in memory of the victims was held in the church, the same one where I would be married in a few days. The priest spoke about the fragility of life, about how we should always be prepared for the divine call. Sitting in the church pew beside Robert, I felt the weight of those words as never before. Life really was fragile, and I had played with mine like a fool. Daniel was dead. The man who had made me betray the love of my life, who had threatened me, who knew my darkest secret, no longer existed. No one would ever know what we had done. The stolen afternoons, the lies, the desperate kisses. It was as if God himself had intervened to preserve my future, my marriage, my reputation. I felt a horrible mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that my secret was safe. Guilt for feeling relief at a man's death. I never hated myself as much as during those days. But life went on. The wedding was scheduled, the preparations nearly complete. Robert, always sensitive, suggested postponing the ceremony out of respect for the mourning families. "Maybe it's not appropriate to celebrate amid so much sadness," he pondered. I was horrified by the idea. Postponing meant more time for something to go wrong, for my secret to be discovered, for Daniel's ghost to continue haunting me. "We can't," I argued. "Everything is ready. The out-of-town guests have already organized their trips. Life needs to move forward." Robert, always understanding, agreed after some hesitation. The wedding would happen as planned, although with a slightly more somber tone out of respect for recent events. In the days leading up to the ceremony, I buried myself in final details, working to exhaustion to keep my mind occupied. At night, however, I couldn't escape the nightmares. I dreamed of Daniel covered in mud, crawling out from the debris, pointing at me in accusation. I would wake up sweating, heart racing, and look to the side, relieved to see Robert sleeping peacefully at his parents' house with no idea of the demons that tormented me. On the eve of the wedding, following tradition, I spent the night at my parents' house. My mother and my aunts helped prepare everything: the perfectly pressed dress, the adjusted veil, the flower crown I would wear, the white shoes that had cost almost a month of my father's salary. "Are you nervous, daughter?" my mother asked as she brushed my hair before I went to bed. "It's normal. Every bride is." If she only knew that my nervousness had nothing to do with the common anxiety of a bride. I feared that somehow my betrayal would be stamped on my face, visible to everyone on the most important day of my life. "A little, Mom," I answered, forcing a smile. "But I'm happy. Robert is a wonderful man." She kissed my forehead. "You're lucky, Evelyn. Men like him are rare. I know you'll be very happy." Her words were like stabs in my chest. Yes, Robert was rare, and I had almost thrown everything away for a whim, for an adventure with no future. The shame burned inside me. That night I prayed again. I asked forgiveness for my sins. I swore I would be the best wife Robert could wish for, that I would compensate for my betrayal with a lifetime of devotion and loyalty. I fell asleep exhausted, but at peace with my decision. The past was buried along with Daniel. The future would be built on new foundations. The wedding day dawned sunny, as if the heavens blessed our union. From early on, the house filled with relatives, friends, neighbors, all wanting to help with the final preparations. My mother coordinated everything efficiently while I let myself be carried by the traditional rituals. The bath with rose petals to attract happiness in marriage, the glass of sweet wine to calm the nerves. Something old, my grandmother's necklace, something new, the dress sewn by my mother and me, something borrowed, my godmother's pearl earrings, something blue, a small ribbon sewn into the hem of the dress. As they did my makeup and hair, I tried to focus only on the present moment, on the man waiting for me at the altar, on the future we would build together. Daniel was dead. My secret was safe. It was time to turn the page definitively. At noon, when the car decorated with flowers arrived to take me to the church, I felt a strange calm envelop me. I had made my decision. I had committed a terrible mistake, but now I would do everything right. I would be the wife Robert deserved. I would be worthy of the love he dedicated to me. The small church of Our Lady of Grace, where I had been baptized and had attended Mass every Sunday of my life, was beautifully decorated with white lilies and satin ribbons. The dark wooden pews accommodated practically the entire town. No one wanted to miss the wedding of the young teacher to Mr. Matthews' daughter, an event that promised to be the most elegant of the year. When the car stopped in front of the church, my father helped me out, careful that the dress didn't drag on the ground. His eyes were teary, something rare for such a reserved man. "I'm proud of you, my daughter," he said, adjusting the veil over my face. "Robert is a good man. He'll take good care of you." I nodded, unable to speak without tears coming. My father offered his arm, and we entered the small atrium of the church, waiting for the signal of the wedding march. When the music began, I felt my heart race. The doors opened, revealing the central aisle decorated with flowers. At the altar, Robert waited for me, elegant in his dark suit, his face illuminated by a smile that seemed to contain all the promises in the world. Beside him were his parents, his younger brother as best man, and the professor who had been his mentor. On the other side of the altar, my mother already occupied her place, along with my baptism godmother and my closest cousin. I began to walk slowly, as we had rehearsed, one step at a time to the rhythm of the music, letting everyone admire the dress that had cost so many hours of work. The guests smiled, some already wiping tears of emotion. It was then that I noticed something strange. A murmur began in the last pews, people turning, expressions of confusion and surprise. Perhaps someone feeling ill, I thought, or a late guest making more noise than they should. I continued walking, focused on Robert, on his smile that now seemed to falter slightly. He was looking over my shoulder at something or someone behind me, and his expression changed from confusion to concern. The murmuring increased, transforming into audible whispers. The music continued, but now competing with the growing noise from the guests. Something was wrong, very wrong. I stopped halfway to the altar, unsure what to do. That's when I felt my father stiffen beside me, his arm becoming tense under my fingers. I turned to him seeking guidance and saw that he too was looking back toward the church entrance, his face as pale as paper. Slowly, against all my self-preservation instinct, I turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. And there he was, standing at the entrance of the church, leaning on an improvised cane, his face marked by recent scars and his clothes disheveled, as if he had traveled for days without rest. Daniel. Daniel, who should be dead. Daniel buried under tons of earth. Daniel, my darkest secret, materialized on my wedding day like a vengeful ghost. Our eyes met across the church. In his, I saw determination and an almost feverish glint. I felt the blood leave my face, my knees weaken. The bouquet slipped from my hands, falling silently onto the red carpet that covered the central aisle. The entire church seemed frozen in a moment, suspended in time. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of held breaths and confused whispers. And then, with a clear voice that echoed through the stone walls of the old church, Daniel broke the silence. "I object to this marriage." Time seemed to freeze in that moment. My lungs refused to function, as if all the air had been sucked from the church. I felt my father's hand tighten on my arm, perhaps to prevent me from falling, perhaps to prevent me from fleeing. The priest, an elderly man who had baptized most of those present, looked from Daniel to me, then to Robert, completely lost before this unprecedented interruption. In his 50 years celebrating weddings, no one had ever actually objected when he asked the ritual question. "My son," the priest finally managed to say, "you cannot simply—" But Daniel was already advancing down the aisle, visibly limping, leaning on the improvised cane with each step. His eyes never left mine, as if there was no one else in that church. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted the floor to open and swallow me, but I remained paralyzed, trapped by that accusatory gaze. "Evelyn," he said my name with a mixture of pain and anger that made everyone present hold their breath. "Did you really think I wouldn't come?" Robert descended the altar steps and came toward me, instinctively placing himself between me and Daniel, as if sensing the danger, even without understanding its nature. "What does this mean?" he asked, with a calmness that only made the situation more terrifying. "Who are you?" Daniel smiled, but it wasn't the seductive smile I knew. It was something bitter, almost cruel. "Ask your bride who I am. Ask her where she was during those afternoons while you were in New York." A sepulchral silence took over the church. You could even hear the buzzing of a fly near the stained glass window. All eyes turned to me. My parents, my friends, the entire town, and primarily Robert's confused brown eyes. "Ev," his voice was almost a whisper, begging for an explanation, for a denial, for anything that would restore the normality of that day. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. What could I say? How could I deny before the living evidence of my sin? How could I lie looking directly into the eyes of the man I loved? Daniel didn't wait for my answer. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small object that I immediately recognized, the white silk handkerchief with my embroidered initials, the same one I had lost during one of our meetings. "You forgot this in my bed, darling," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "along with your promise ring that you took off before each meeting." There was a collective gasp of shock. My mother brought her hands to her mouth. My father took a step back, moving away from me as if I had some contagious disease. And Robert, oh, Robert, his face transformed into a mask of pain so pure, so absolute, that I felt my heart shatter. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. His eyes begged me to deny it, to shout that it was all a lie, a cruel setup by this unknown man. But I couldn't lie anymore. Not there, not like that, not with the weight of so many stares upon me. I closed my eyes, unable to face the contempt I would certainly see in the faces of everyone I loved, and nodded almost imperceptibly. The murmur that ran through the church was like the harbinger of a storm. I heard someone, one of my cousins perhaps, say, "What a shame," in a low voice, but audible in the tense silence. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Robert take a step back, as if he had received a physical blow. The color had completely abandoned his face, leaving him with a cadaverous pallor that contrasted with the red of his eyes. "You," he began, but his voice failed. He swallowed hard and tried again. "You slept with him while I was away?" Daniel laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the air like a knife. "It wasn't just once, teacher. It was weeks. Every afternoon, while you wrote passionate letters from New York, she was in my bed, moaning my name, promising she'd end things with you." "That's not true," I finally managed to scream, partially recovering my voice. "I never promised to leave you, never." But the damage was already done. What difference did it make whether I had promised to leave Robert or not? The betrayal was there, exposed for everyone to see, undeniable and unforgivable. Robert looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. There was no anger in his eyes, just an infinite sadness that was much worse. Slowly, he removed the ring he had placed minutes before, during the vows that were interrupted. He looked at the small gold circle in his palm for a moment, as if he didn't understand what it was. Then, with a deliberate movement, he let the ring fall to the church floor. The clink of metal against stone echoed in the absolute silence. Without saying a word, he turned and walked to the altar, picked up his folded jacket from the bench, and headed for the side door of the sacristy. "Robert, please!" I cried, running a few steps in his direction, stumbling on the hem of the wedding dress. "Let me explain." He stopped, but didn't turn. His shoulders were hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. "There's nothing to explain, Evelyn," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "It's over." And with that, he walked out the door, disappearing into the bright midday sun. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if we were all trapped in a frozen photograph of disaster. Me in the middle of the aisle, the white dress now stained with dust where I had fallen to my knees. Daniel, a few steps behind, leaning on his cane, a bitter smile on his marked face, and all the guests in the pews, with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. It was my father who finally broke the spell. He approached me, not to help me up, but to say in a low voice, trembling with contained emotion, "You are no longer my daughter." Those words, more than anything else that happened that day, were what finally broke me. A sob escaped my throat, followed by another and another, until I was openly crying, still kneeling on the church floor, the wedding dress spread around me like a puddle of spilled milk. My mother began to cry too, supported by my aunt. People started to get up, some leaving hastily, avoiding looking at me, others lingering to absorb every detail of the scandal, feeding the gossip that would run for months. Daniel approached slowly and knelt beside me, with difficulty due to the injury in his leg. "Now you can come with me," he said, low enough that only I could hear. "There's nothing holding you here anymore." I looked at him through the tears, really seeing him for the first time. He wasn't the elegant, sophisticated man who had seduced me. He was someone consumed by resentment, by obsession, someone who had gone through hell, not for love, but for possessiveness, for wounded pride. "You destroyed my life," I whispered. He shook his head, his eyes hard as stones. "No, Evelyn. You destroyed your own life when you chose to lie to everyone. I just brought the truth to light." I stood up with difficulty, refusing his outstretched hand. "Go away," I said, each word loaded with a hatred I had never felt before. "I never want to see your face again." For a moment, I thought he might insist, perhaps even force me to go with him. But something in my expression must have convinced him of the futility. With a final look of contempt, he turned and limped out of the church, leaving behind the chaos he had created. I was left alone in the aisle. The guests now leaving in groups, murmuring among themselves, some casting glances of pity, others of judgment. The priest had retreated to the sacristy, probably to pray for my sinful soul. My parents had gone without looking back. I sat heavily on the first pew, unable to process everything that had happened in so few minutes. My wedding, my family, my reputation, my future, everything had collapsed like a house of cards at the first gust of wind. I don't know how long I sat there alone in the nearly empty church. The sun began to set, casting red rays through the stained glass, staining the floor with colors that once would have seemed beautiful. Now they only reminded me of blood. Finally, when the shadows had already lengthened and the cold began to seep through the old stone walls, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Mrs. Augusta, the old church cleaner, a woman who had seen so many weddings, baptisms, and funerals that nothing surprised her anymore. "Come, girl," she said gently. "You can't stay here all night." "Where will I go?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying so much. "I can't go back home. My father said I'm no longer his daughter." He spoke with anger in his heart, Mrs. Augusta replied, helping me to stand. "Give it time. Meanwhile, you can stay with me. My house is small, but there's room for one more lost soul." I let her guide me out of the church into the night that had fallen over the small town. The streets were deserted, everyone probably locked in their homes, commenting on the day's scandal, delighting in others' disgrace, thanking heaven they weren't the subject of conversation. Mrs. Augusta's house was on the outskirts of town, a simple wooden structure with a tin roof and a small garden in front, where she grew herbs and flowers. There, in that modest room, lit by a kerosene lamp, I took off the ruined wedding dress, washed the tears and sweat from my face, and accepted a cup of chamomile tea that the old lady offered me. "What do I do now?" I asked, more to myself than to her. Mrs. Augusta sat in the rocking chair, her wrinkled hands working on an embroidery in the dim light. "You go on, my child, one day at a time. Life doesn't end because of a mistake, no matter how big it is." "No one will forgive me," I murmured. "The whole town hates me now." She nodded without evasion. "Maybe. But the world is big, Evelyn. There are places where no one knows your name or your story, places where you can start over." That night, lying in the narrow bed that Mrs. Augusta had prepared for me, I thought about her words. Start over. Was it possible? After all I had done, all the people I had hurt? The answer came as a whisper in my mind, almost as if it were the voice of my grandmother, who had always been the wisest in the family. Life goes on, dear. Even when we think we don't have the strength to continue, the sun rises the next day, and we rise with it. The next morning, before the sun rose, I wrote a letter to Robert. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew I didn't deserve it. I simply expressed my deep and sincere regret and wished that he would find the happiness that I had so cruelly stolen. I left the letter with Mrs. Augusta, who promised to deliver it. With only the clothes on my back and some coins that the kind lady insisted I take, I caught the first bus passing through the main highway. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be far from there, away from the accusing looks, the whispers, the doors that would close at my approach. As the bus began to move away, I looked one last time at the small town where I had been born and raised, where I had loved and betrayed, where I had lost everything. A part of me would remain forever there, buried with the broken dreams and broken promises. But another part, the part that still breathed, that still felt, that still hoped, that part looked ahead, to the road that stretched beyond the horizon, to the uncertain future that awaited me. That's how I began my journey of redemption. A journey that would last decades, full of pains and joys, of falls and fresh starts. A journey that would eventually lead me back to the beginning, but as a completely different person. The bus took me to Chicago, a city so large and impersonal that I felt like an ant in a world of giants. I, who had never left rural Kentucky, now found myself alone in one of the biggest cities in the country, with little money in my pocket and a heart shattered by guilt. In those first days, I slept in a cheap downtown boarding house, a dirty and noisy place, but the only one I could afford. The nights were long, filled with nightmares where Robert looked at me with those empty eyes, devoid of any emotion except pain. Where my father turned his back on me. Where Daniel laughed as he destroyed everything I loved. I would wake up sweating, often screaming, to the momentary relief of realizing I was alone, until reality hit me again, reminding me that those nightmares were just reflections of the truth I had created with my own hands. I needed work, and fast. The little money Mrs. Augusta had given me was running out. I walked for days through the streets of Chicago, knocking door to door, asking for any kind of job. My appearance must have caused suspicion. Simple and worn clothes, eyes swollen from crying so much, hands trembling with anxiety. Many doors closed before I could even explain why I was there. Finally, after a week of desperate searching, I found work in a small garment factory in the immigrant district. The owner, an elderly Jewish gentleman, needed someone who knew how to sew. The hours were long, the pay minimal, and the environment stuffy, full of the constant noise of sewing machines and the smell of new fabric. But for me, it was a lifeline in an ocean of despair. I rented a tiny room in a more decent boarding house, where at least I could sleep without fearing for my own safety. It was a cubicle with space only for a single bed, a small closet, and a little table. The bathroom was shared with 6 other women who, like me, had come to the big city in search of a better life or fleeing from something they had left behind. The months dragged on in a monotonous routine. I woke before dawn, had a quick coffee at the corner bakery, worked until nightfall, returned to my room, ate something simple that I had bought on the way, and slept, too exhausted to think about the past or fear the future. Gradually, I became invisible. It was what I wanted, to disappear into the anonymity of the big city, to be just another face in the crowd, without history, without past, without scandal. I avoided making friendships, fearing that somehow my secret would be discovered, that someone from my hometown would appear and recognize me as the one who betrayed her fiancé at the altar. However, loneliness has its own weight. There are moments when silence becomes deafening, when the absence of a friendly voice transforms into an oppressive presence that suffocates more than any crowd. In these moments, usually late at night, I allowed myself to think of Robert, of my parents, of everything I had lost. The tears came silently, wetting the pillow until exhaustion took me to sleep. A year passed like this, then another. The pain didn't diminish. It just transformed into something different, less acute, more constant, like a background hum that never really disappears. I learned to live with it, to carry it as if it were part of me, an invisible scar that constantly reminded me of the price of betrayal. In 1970, Mr. Goldstein, the owner of the garment factory, passed away in his sleep. The small factory was sold to a larger company, and many employees, including myself, were laid off. I found myself without a job again, with few savings and an uncertain future. It was at this moment, when everything seemed to be falling apart once more, that I met Helena. She worked at the bakery I visited every morning, always with a kind smile and a friendly word. When she noticed my downcast expression that morning, she insisted on knowing what had happened. I don't know why. Perhaps the fatigue of carrying my burden alone, perhaps the genuine kindness in her eyes, I told her about losing my job. "My sister has a bridal shop downtown," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to offer help to an almost stranger. "She's looking for an experienced seamstress. I'll talk to her about you." The irony didn't escape me. I, who had destroyed my own wedding, would now sew dresses for hopeful brides, creating symbols of promises that I had not been able to honor. But I couldn't afford to refuse a job opportunity. Helena's sister, Carmen, was an astute businesswoman, but with a surprisingly generous heart. After a quick test of my sewing skills, she hired me immediately. The salary was better than at the factory, and the work environment infinitely more pleasant. A well-lit atelier with soft music playing in the background, the aroma of fresh coffee, and the constant coming and going of excited brides. Each dress fitting was a small torture for me. Observing the glow in those women's eyes, the blush of expectation on their faces, the mothers crying with emotion. Everything reminded me of what I had thrown away. Sometimes, when adjusting a sleeve or a neckline, my hands would tremble so much that I needed to stop, breathe deeply, and remind myself that the past couldn't be changed, only accepted. Carmen noticed, of course. She was too observant not to perceive my reaction whenever weddings were mentioned. One night, after closing the shop, when only the two of us remained tidying the atelier, she offered me a glass of wine and sat beside me. "What's your story, Evelyn?" she asked directly. "And don't tell me there isn't one. I see the pain in your eyes every time a bride tries on a dress." Perhaps it was the wine. Perhaps the constant kindness of this woman who had given me a chance without asking questions. Perhaps simply the weight of carrying my secret alone for so long. The words began to flow, hesitant at first, then like a torrent that could no longer be contained. I told her everything. The true love for Robert, The temptation represented by Daniel, the unforgivable betrayal, the ruined wedding, the self-imposed exile. I expected to see judgment in her eyes, perhaps even disgust. Instead, I saw understanding and a compassion that left me speechless. "We all make mistakes, dear," she said softly when I finished, tears freely running down my face. "Some bigger than others, it's true. But what defines our character isn't the mistake itself, but what we do afterwards." "How can I fix something like this?" I asked, my voice choked. "How can I repair the harm I caused?" "Maybe you can't," she answered honestly. "Some things, once broken, never go back to being as they were. But that doesn't mean you should spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. True repentance isn't in eternal suffering, but in change, in the commitment to be a better person." That conversation marked a turning point in my life. For the first time since the disaster of my wedding, I allowed myself to think of a future that wasn't just an extension of the punishment I believed I deserved. I allowed myself the possibility of redemption, not through forgetting the past, but through accepting it as part of the person I had become. Carmen and Helena became more than boss and colleagues. They became the family I had lost. Gradually, with their help, I began to rebuild not just my external life, but also my inner world, so devastated by guilt and regret. In 1972, with financial help from Carmen, I opened my own small alterations and adjustments atelier. I didn't work with wedding dresses, the wound was still too deep, but with everyday clothes, school uniforms, Halloween costumes. My clientele grew quickly, thanks to the quality of my work and Carmen's recommendations. The atelier was on the ground floor of an old brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, with a small apartment upstairs where I lived. It was simple but mine, the first place I could really call home since I left my hometown. On the walls, I hung some watercolors that Helena had painted for me, colorful curtains that Carmen had helped me choose, and a small shelf with the few books I had managed to buy over the years. It was a cozy space, full of natural light and the smell of clean fabric. I still dreamed of Robert, of my parents, of the life I could have had. But now the dreams came less frequently, and when I woke up, the weight on my chest was a little less crushing. I was beginning to learn the difficult art of living with regret without being consumed by it. In 1974, something unexpected happened. A customer entered my atelier with a request for alterations to a suit. "It's for my husband," she explained. "He recently lost weight, and nothing fits him anymore." When I raised my eyes from the fabric I was marking, I almost dropped the scissors. It was Mrs. Augusta, the church cleaner who had taken me in on that fateful night, now 7 years older, but with the same kind and wise eyes. "Evelyn?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "My blessed Virgin, is it really you?" I ran to hug her, tears flowing freely. Between sobs and laughter, she explained that she had married a widower from Chicago 2 years earlier and moved to the big city. "I never imagined finding you here," she said, holding my hands in hers. "I thought about you so much all these years, prayed so much for you to be well." Over cups of strong coffee and homemade cookies, Mrs. Augusta told me news from my hometown. My father had died the previous year from a sudden heart attack. My mother continued to live, now with my younger sister, who had married and had 2 small children. And Robert, my heart almost stopped when she mentioned his name. He had left town a few months after the disaster of our wedding, accepting a position at a university in Boston. According to news that occasionally arrived, he had married a teacher, a work colleague, and had a young son. "He seems well from what they say," Mrs. Augusta added softly, observing my reaction. "He found his path, just as you found yours." A part of me felt deep relief in knowing that Robert had moved on, that he had found the happiness he deserved. Another part, small, selfish, more human, felt a twinge of pain imagining him building a life with someone else, loving her as he had once loved me. "And my parents?" I asked hesitantly. "Did they speak of me before?" "Your father never mentioned your name in public," Mrs. Augusta answered honestly. But your mother once confessed to me that he kept the letter you left, and sometimes, late at night, she found him reading it with tears in his eyes. This revelation broke something inside me, a barrier I had built around the most painful memories. I cried as I hadn't cried in years, for the father I had lost without a chance for reconciliation, for the mother who suffered in silence, for the lost time that I would never recover. Mrs. Augusta stayed with me until I calmed down, offering the same silent and strong comfort she had given me that night in the church. Before leaving, she left the address of her new house and made me promise to visit her. "Your mother would like to know that you're well," she said at the door. "If you allow, I can write to her." I agreed with my heart racing with fear and hope. It was the first step in reconnecting with the past I had abandoned, not to relive it or to seek absolution, but to accept that it was part of who I was. That night, alone in my small apartment, I looked out the window at the lights of Chicago, the city that had taken me in when I had nothing but shame and regret. I thought of Robert, silently wishing him all the happiness in the world. I thought of my mother, imagining what it would be like to see her again if I would ever have that chance. I thought of myself, of the foolish and selfish young woman I had been, and of the woman I was becoming, imperfect, marked by the scars of the past, but finally learning to live at peace with my mistakes. "Life goes on," I murmured to myself, repeating the words that had given me strength to take the first step away from the ruins of my past. Life always goes on. 3 months after the reunion with Mrs. Augusta, I received a letter that would again change the course of my life. The simple envelope had handwriting I immediately recognized, the inclined and careful script of my mother, who had taught me to write, holding my hand over the paper when I was just a child. My hands trembled so much I could barely open the envelope. I sat in the small armchair by the window of my apartment, took several deep breaths, and finally mustered the courage to read. "My daughter," the letter began. And just those 2 words were enough to bring tears. After so many years, my mother still called me daughter. This simple acknowledgement meant more than any explicit forgiveness could. The letter was long, written in several sessions, as if she had picked up the pen and set it down many times, searching for the right words. She told of life in the small town after my departure, the pain and shame the family felt, the heavy silence that settled in our house. She spoke of my father's death, how he had descended into a period of depression aggravated by heart problems. "Your father was too proud a man to admit it," she wrote, "but I know he died with a broken heart, not because of what you did, but because of his last words to you. He kept your letter in the drawer of his bedside table, along with your graduation photo. On nights when he couldn't sleep, I would find him looking at both." She also told of my younger sister, Cecilia, now married and mother of 2 boys, my nephews whom I had never met, about how life in town had changed little, the same families, the same gossip, the same slow pace that I had so much wanted to escape when I was younger. At the end of the letter, after telling all the news, my mother finally addressed what must have been weighing on her heart for so many years. "I won't say I understand why you did what you did, Evelyn. Some choices are difficult, even for a mother to understand. But I know you paid a high price for your mistake, perhaps higher than you deserved. 7 years is too long to be away from home. Mrs. Augusta told me you've built a new life, that you have your own business, that you've become an independent and strong woman. I'm proud of that, daughter. I've always been proud of you, even in the most difficult moments." The last lines were blurred, as if tears had fallen on the paper as she wrote. "If you want, if you feel it's time, your home is still your home. Your bed is still in the same place, your books on the same shelf. I'm not getting any younger, Evelyn, and I would like to see your face again before I leave this world. But I'll understand if the pain is still too great for you to return. I just want you to know that, no matter what happened, you will always be my daughter, and my love for you has never diminished." I read and reread that letter dozens of times in the weeks that followed. I showed it to Carmen and Helena, who encouraged me to make the trip to seek the closure I so needed. But the fear was paralyzing. What if upon arriving there, I realized that the wounds were too deep to heal? What if people in town still looked at me with the same contempt, still whispered as I passed by? Worse still, what if I crossed paths with Robert? Mrs. Augusta had said he was in Boston, but what if he returned to visit family? Could I bear to see him with his new wife, his son, the life we should have built together? Almost a year passed before I gathered enough courage. It was in the winter of 1975, after closing the atelier for renovations, that I decided it was time. I wrote to my mother advising her of the date of my arrival. I asked a friend to take care of the apartment and bought a bus ticket for the journey back to the past I so feared. The trip was long and uncomfortable, not just because of the potholed roads and the old bus, but mainly because of the anxiety that grew with each mile. When I finally saw the small cluster of houses and the church tower on the horizon, my stomach tied into such a tight knot that I thought I would faint. The bus stopped in the main square, the same one from which I had departed 7 years earlier, with little more than the clothes on my back and a shattered heart. I got off hesitantly, looking around, expecting to see hostile faces, to hear malicious comments. Instead, I saw only the normal daily life of a small town. Ladies shopping, children playing, men talking in front of the store. Some curious looks turned to me. A stranger arriving by bus always arouses interest in small towns, but there was no immediate recognition in their eyes. Of course, I had changed. At 29, I was no longer the 21-year-old whose ruined wedding photo had been the talk of the year. My face had matured. My body changed. Even my way of walking was different, more confident, more determined. Time had transformed me on the outside, just as pain and regret had transformed me inside. I picked up my small suitcase and began walking toward the house of my childhood at the other end of town. Each step was a challenge. Each familiar corner brought memories that I had tried to bury. The bakery where Robert bought sweet bread for our Sunday picnics, the school where he had taught, the bench in the square where we had sat so many times, planning a future that would never happen. When I finally reached the tree-lined street where I grew up, my heart was beating so hard that it echoed in my ears. The house was exactly as I remembered. The light blue facade, the white windows, the small garden in front where my mother cultivated her roses and geraniums. I stopped before the white picket fence, unable to take the last step. What if she had changed her mind? What if the letter had just been a moment of weakness and now she regretted inviting me back? Before I could make a decision, the house door opened and there she was, my mother, older than in my memories. Her hair now completely gray, her face marked by wrinkles that weren't there when I left. But her eyes, those eyes that had always known how to read my soul, were the same. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the distance that separated us. Not just the few yards of the garden, but the years of silence, the unspoken words, the pain shared for different reasons. It was she who moved first, descending the porch steps with an energy that defied her age. She opened the gate and, without saying a word, extended her arms to me. I dropped the suitcase and threw myself into that embrace, the first in 7 long years. We cried together, right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see or judge. It was a cry of mourning for the lost time, but also of relief for this moment of reunion that had so often seemed impossible. "You came back," she whispered finally, pulling away just enough to look at my face, her hands touching my cheeks as if to confirm I was real. My daughter came home. The days that followed were of reconnection, of long conversations that stretched through entire nights, of comfortable silences as we worked together in the kitchen, preparing the dishes of my childhood. My sister Cecilia came to visit with her husband and 2 boys, my nephews, who looked at me with childish curiosity, with no idea of the turbulent past that had kept their aunt away for so long. Gradually, I began to circulate around town. The first outings were tense. I stiffened every time someone looked at me for too long, expecting recognition, judgment. There were some uncomfortable moments, of course. The pharmacist's wife who crossed the street not to pass me, my father's old friend who turned his face when I passed, the elderly lady who made the sign of the cross as if I were some kind of demon. But to my surprise, most people reacted with distant politeness, or, in some cases, with genuine kindness. Time had softened the edges of the scandal. New gossip, new dramas had taken the place of mine in the collective memory of the small town. In the second week of my visit, I summoned the courage to do what, deep down, I knew I needed to do from the moment I decided to return. I walked to the municipal cemetery, a quiet place in the hills outside town, where generations of local inhabitants rested under simple crosses and marble headstones. My father's grave was modest, well-tended, with fresh flowers that my mother must have regularly changed. His name, dates of birth and death, and a simple inscription: beloved husband, dedicated father, man of unshakable character. I knelt on the damp grass before the headstone, touching the letters carved in the cold stone. This was the closest I would ever get to my father again. I would never hear his deep voice again, never feel the strong embrace that, though rare, always made me feel safe. I would never have the chance to ask forgiveness, to say I loved him despite everything, to try to build a bridge over the abyss that my actions had created between us. Forgive me, Dad, I said softly, tears blurring my vision. Forgive me for not being the daughter you deserved. Forgive me for breaking your heart. I don't know how long I stayed there talking to a headstone, pouring out years of regret and longing. When I finally stood up, feeling my knees numb from prolonged contact with the ground, I realized I was no longer alone. A figure stood a few yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of a cypress tree. For a frightening moment, I thought it was an apparition. My father's ghost, perhaps, or worse, Daniel's, come to torment me again. But then, the figure took a step forward, out of the shadows, and my heart almost stopped. Robert was different. Older, of course, with some gray strands at the temples, deeper lines around the eyes and mouth, but it was still unmistakably him, the man I had loved since adolescence, the man whose life I had ruined in a moment of unforgivable weakness. We stood looking at each other in silence, separated by a few gravestones and by an ocean of pain and regret. My mind raced, searching for something to say, some way to start a conversation for which there was no possible preparation. It was he who spoke first, his voice deeper than I remembered, but still with that gentle cadence that had always calmed me. I heard you were in town, he said simply. My mother told me when I arrived yesterday. I'm visiting my mother, I answered, my voice almost inaudible. I didn't know you would be here. I come every year on this date, he explained, indicating with a gesture a grave a few yards away. Death anniversary of my father. I nodded, not knowing what to say. The silence extended between us, loaded with unspoken words, unanswered questions, a past that couldn't be changed. You look well, he finally said, his eyes studying my face with an expression I couldn't decipher. There was no anger there, as I had so feared, but also not the warmth that once existed. You too, I replied. Mrs. Augusta told me you're living in Boston now, a university professor. He nodded. History of education at BU. And you, what have you been doing? I briefly told him about my atelier in Chicago, about the life I had built for myself in recent years. He listened attentively, as he always did, even when we talked about trivial matters in adolescence. When I finished, there was another silence, longer this time. There was so much to be said, and at the same time, perhaps nothing more needed to be said. The past couldn't be altered, the wounds might heal, but the scars would remain forever. I need to go, he said finally, looking at his watch. My wife and son are waiting for me at my mother's house for lunch. Of course, I replied quickly. It was good to see you, Robert. He hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing his next words. You know, Evelyn, for a long time I carried so much anger, he finally said, looking not at me, but at the horizon beyond the cemetery. Anger at you, at Daniel, even at myself for not having realized what was happening. That anger almost consumed me. He paused, breathing deeply before continuing. But with time, I realized I couldn't live like that. I had to learn to forgive, not for you, but for myself. I had to accept that what happened was part of my path, no matter how painful it was. He looked me in the eyes then, and I saw there not the love that once existed, nor the hatred I so feared, but something more complex, a hard-won peace, an understanding that comes only after much suffering. I hope you found your peace too, Evelyn. With those words, he turned and walked toward the cemetery gate, his figure becoming smaller in the distance, until he disappeared completely. I stayed there for a long time after he left, among the silent graves, thinking about his words. Peace. Had I found it? Perhaps not completely, not yet, but I was on the way. I returned to Chicago a week later, promising my mother I wouldn't stay away for so long again. In the years that followed, I visited her regularly, gradually rebuilding our relationship, creating new memories to replace the painful ones. When she passed away in 1982, I was by her side, holding her hand, grateful for the years of reconciliation we had. My atelier prospered, expanding to a larger store. Eventually, I met Peter, a kind and patient widower who loved me despite my past, who never demanded that I pretend to be someone I wasn't. We married in a simple ceremony in 1980, and he brought to my life not just his love, but also his 2 teenage children, whom over time I learned to love as if they were my own. Today, at 79, I look back and see my life as a long path of learning. The terrible mistake I made in my youth doesn't define who I am, but it certainly shaped who I became. I learned in the hardest way about the consequences of our choices, about how a moment of weakness can alter the course of many lives. But I also learned about forgiveness, what we give to others, and more importantly, what we give to ourselves. I learned that it's possible to carry regret without being crushed by it, that it's possible to build a meaningful life even after the gravest mistakes. And if there's a lesson I'd like to leave for you who are watching me today, it's this. Truth always finds its way to the light. The secrets we keep, the lies we tell, eventually come to the surface, often in the most painful way possible. And when that happens, the only thing we can do is face the consequences with courage and humility. I don't know what happened to Daniel after that fateful day in the church. I never heard of him again. For many years I held resentment towards him for exposing my betrayal in such a cruel way. But with time, I realized that, although his methods were merciless, he had only brought to light a truth that I should have revealed on my own. As for Robert, I learned from my sister that he had a brilliant career as an educator, published important books on teaching methods, and created a loving family with his wife. I never saw him again after that meeting in the cemetery, but I carry in my heart the hope that he found the happiness he so deserved. And I found, not the life I had dreamed of in my youth, but one that in many ways was richer and more meaningful than I had ever imagined. In the mistakes and successes, in the falls and fresh starts, in the tears and smiles, I found my own path to redemption. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touches just one person, if it helps someone to think twice before following the path of lies and betrayal, then it will have been worth reliving these painful memories. Life is too precious to be wasted on choices that hurt those we love and, in the end, ourselves. Now, before ending, I'd like to ask everyone to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Your company on this journey through my memories means a lot to me. And remember, no matter how dark our mistakes may seem, there is always a way back to the light. There is always the possibility of redemption for those who seek it with a truly repentant heart.